This is Ronan Flinkurran giving a run through of the Koshti design. So I just wanted to make a little video for you guys to have as a reference. It kind of talks about the UX principles behind Koshti, some of the tooling and things that were used in the UI design and build of the project, and then to kind of give a deep dive into some of the wireframes. This is something just to complement the syncs and Zooms and various chats that we'll have as you work on the project, but I just wanted to also have a central place that you could come to see some of that stuff. So I'm going to share my screen and kind of run through some of the design aspects of Koshti. Okay, so let's give a quick kind of summary. I'm going to do like a little intro about it, go through UX, which is kind of like a little bit of the research side and the background, and ultimately some of the goals of what Koshti is trying to do. The UI design, which is more specific about technical aspects of reading the Brigade API and rendering an interface on that. Then I'll walk you through the wireframes that are there for you to use as resources as you look to evaluate your own design and figure out what things you do and don't want to include in a new work on Koshti. And then ultimately, you know, just we'll kind of leave it with that and like help you formulate what the future could look like, which really is going to be shaped by your work. So hopefully some of this stuff is already familiar to you guys, kind of the fundamental concepts of Brigade. You know, a tool that runs event-based scripting in Kubernetes. So something happens, you trigger something, an event runs, which could have a whole bunch of things happening within it, and you get results. And Koshti is a place to view and explore those results right now. And maybe that's something that could grow in depth and complexity depending on the work that's going to happen. But one of the things you hear a lot with Brigade is this idea of pipelines. And that's kind of like one of the core goals of Brigade and Koshti is to allow you to create flexible pipelines that do things. And we leave it very open-ended. So a couple of things that we'll be looking at a lot here. It's the demo of Koshti, which hopefully you've seen. On the Koshti repo, there is a self-hosted demo. It's basically running off the repo's GitHub Pages instance. It looks like this. And it starts with a dashboard. It shows us a whole bunch of projects, a whole bunch of data coming in from Brigade API that where we're running Brigade in our own internal dog fooding clusters. So our team has a api.brigade.sh, and wherever we run Brigade, we try and get that data over to our demo Koshti dashboard. Just kind of helps us populate the dashboard with some different interesting things. And you can navigate all of this without any login or any credentials because the initial Koshti has no user auth. So it's just read only. It's exporting data from Brigade, and you can see, you know, different checks and things running. And having this available, I think, is just a useful resource when you're working on the front end to be able to see an existing version of it. You can see, you know, you can pick apart the code of the interface through your inspector tools, and then you can also kind of like look at the API on one side, look at what's rendered on this side, and it helps you understand how it's all working together. So I'll kind of like refer to this demo a little bit. We'll talk about the API. But really, before I get into the technical stuff about how it's working, I want to talk about the UX, which is probably the most relevant stuff to this team. This kind of area of work, you know, as Koshti was a prototype that quickly kind of became an MVP, product design, user research, you know, user interface work, actual front-end development, a lot of that stuff blurred together. That might be the case for your own team. You guys have taken some extra steps already to really define roles and sort of separate some of those concerns, but the UX design of Koshti kind of like mashes a bit of that stuff together just purely out of our own sort of like speed and often sort of like a distributed way of working. So there's a couple of fundamental things about the UX of Koshti. One is it's trying to really do service to Brigade. It's part of Brigade as a project. It's really like a complementary tool. So the goals for Koshti were to present events and data from Brigade in a kind of an open-ended way, because Brigade is designed to be open-ended. When we say it's an event-driven scripting tool for Kubernetes, you know, a lot of the stuff that we get into pretty quickly is talking about builds, CI/CD type things. Really, all of these are kind of events, and we don't want to kind of get pigeonholed with Brigade or Koshti in just dealing with a specific type of events. The website kind of shows you some examples, GitHub pushes, updating a database, sending a Slack message, that there's something that happens. You have a configuration in Brigade that detects something as an event, runs a bunch of things, builds, tasks, so forth. And then you get output, you get metadata, you get logs, you get results. And it's that sort of chain of events that is fundamental to Brigade. You can call it different things, but really we wanted the interface for Koshti to work, whether you're running unit tests, whether you're kind of like running a cron job. For the fundamental UX of this, I like to think about non-technical tools that I like in the real world. If this, then that is a great example. It's just a very simple, a thing happens, then there's an action, there's a consequence, and you might be familiar with this, but there's lots of things like this that take an input, run some processes, and there's an output. I like this one because it's very user-friendly. It's very simplistic. So Koshti really is trying to be a very simple way of rendering events. But ultimately too, it's influenced by some of the apps around it. So we think about things like CI tooling. We look at CI tools a lot in the design of Koshti, but we don't want to be kind of too constrained by those. So, I'll kind of show you a couple of quick things here. For example, this was Concourse, which we looked at a lot at the start of Koshti. This is a very complicated kind of high-level CIA tool. It shows you an example application environment here for Concourse that is running all kinds of tests. Every part of their infrastructure has tests running on it. You have Windows tests, you have Docker builds, and everything is very well put together with this interface that shows you the whole kind of health of their build system from a high level, and you can drill down into things. And it was really cool, but we felt like this is kind of, this was a very different opinionated model from, say, what Brigade was trying to do. Another one you'll see a lot is, Travis CI, Jenkins, which is really popular with developers. And typically they are using a lot of stuff that's similar to the GitHub architecture. You have a repo or a project that does stuff. You see kind of metadata. You want to access logs and all these different tools. Once you get familiar with them, there's a few things that start to become pretty important pretty early on. You want to see state. You want to see if it was a success or a fail. You want to kind of get a sense of the tool chain. So if there's a child event that breaks, you want some of those problems to be bubbled up to the surface. And you want to be able to delve down into all of the things that happened in kind of chronological order, see logs. These are all examples from Concourse, but Koshti does more or less the same thing. You have a list of events, it's chronological. When you access the UI, you kind of want to see the current state of things and then to explore specifics, what went wrong? Is it picking up on any change to the config that I ran? Who initiated this particular event? Things like that. So we look at kind of other developer experiences, things like Jenkins, Circle CI, Concourse, internal tools that we've used ourselves over the years. One that I like to look at a lot, I use this tool a lot in my daily work, is Netlify. It's hooked up to GitHub. You deploy an app through merging or pushing a new commit, and something happens. So you see a timeline here of things that have happened. You click into it, you kind of get a summary that it succeed. What was the timestamp? What was the commit behind that particular event? And then you get the logs. And you don't want too much to get in the way of the logs. Logs is very fundamental to a tool like this. So you try not to put too much stuff on top of that screen real estate. So yeah, Koshti shares a lot of commonality with developer tools that are synced up to events that show results. But there's a kind of some fundamental things that can make it different. One of them here is a quote that I've highlighted. It's hard to explain Brigade by comparison to other projects. This is because Brigade is the first in what we hope is an emerging class of tools. It provides an event-based JavaScript programming environment for constructing pipelines or serverless processes. So the pipeline idea, I'll come back to it later when we look at the wireframes. There was a couple of things we wanted to do to try and take the things that were different about Brigade into the interface so that it felt different. And that's one of the goals in UX. You wanted obviously to help the user accomplish their goal, but you also want to kind of highlight anything special you can in your project that makes it actually different from peers, from rivals. This is kind of an idea about designing for delight, which is Intuit have written extensively about themselves. It's basically just a design concept to really relish the unusual and unique features of your project, to make it stand out, to make it memorable. That's often a big source of successful software, is doing something. Often it's the same technology running underneath in an app, but doing something special can really make it succeed in delighting your users, and that then leads to the success of that project. So it's always kind of a goal that you should consider. And I'll come back to that when we look at the wireframes, because there's, I think, a few things we tried to do to achieve that. So that's just like a little bit of the background. I'm going to move on to some of the UI notes for the project. So the UI of Kashti, it's like, I suppose, to back up a little bit, developers often sort of will use terms like UX and UI interchangeably, or they consider maybe the design of a project can easily be, plug in a framework like Bootstrap or Vue or something like that you get design by using a particular tool. The UX design really is kind of the goals of the project to some degree, figuring out what a user is trying to do, and it's really problem solving. It's the core skill that's very much like what developers are always trying to do in their work. But just to differentiate it, the interface design, the UI design, is the implementation of the UX. It's how you achieve the UX, but it's obviously a complementary thing to the UX itself. One of the concepts that I'm using in my wireframes, and it's kind of common in a lot of design for screens, is atomic design. So this is just a very quick way of thinking about web pages and web apps as a series of components and modules, or atoms. So Brad Frost has written a book about this, and it's commonly referenced, and I just thought I'd introduce it. The idea is you have atoms, which are things. An atom could be a button, it could be a piece of text, it could be a search box, and you kind of start to accumulate bigger chunks of things that eventually make pages and make layouts. But ultimately, you start off styling individual elements, and you think about your web pages as a library of modular components that you can kind of put together in different ways. And when you look at the wireframes, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes, that is kind of the methodology I'm using. And then also too, a big part of the UI design is the actual visual design, how it looks. This might be the CSS theme, this might be the framework you're using, it could be animations, but there's a lot of different things that can make for, that can really impact on whether a UI is successful or not. I like to keep this mood board when I'm navigating the design world and looking at technical projects out there. There's a lot of really good ones. Sometimes it's really hard to find developer-friendly interfaces. So this board I have is kind of like a whole collection of things in that world, data views, complex kind of like representations of applications or nodes. Our infrastructure is becoming more complicated in some ways and more abstract. So tools that deal with that can often be hard to visualize the modern developer tooling. So I really enjoy kind of keeping track of things that are happening in our industry. And this mood board, which I've called Nice UI, is a place I like to pin and save some of that stuff. You'll see things like some of the mesosphere tooling, things like even, like what Travis are doing. It's fun to kind of keep track of it, and that all helps to influence the design for Kashti. Okay. So, and here's Azure Pipelines too, which is something that is I talk about things like Travis and Circle CI, those are a few years old now at this point. We see new tooling coming out like Azure Pipelines that is has definitely lots of overlap with what we're trying to do with Brigade and Koshti. So it's interesting to look at how their UI is formulated, what the workflow looks like for developers. And I think that, the pipeline thing is obviously very relevant for our project. So it's interesting to look at all those things and get inspired. I spend a lot of time in design, and I would say you can easily get bogged down looking at the world of opportunity and potential around you. So you really have to have a very focused phase of research where you look at all those ideas, but like put them away, come back to what you're doing, and try not to kind of get too distracted by the world around you, because it is infinite. But a research phase is very important, and you obviously then want to start kind of converging on the things you like and don't like about all these projects and ideas, and focus on what you're actually trying to do with Koshti, what you're trying to do with your project to really make it unique and solve the problem that you're here to work on. So to kind of delve down into some of the more technical aspects of the UI, I want to talk again about the Brigade API. The Koshti interface is basically mapped to the API very closely. The API that we use for 1.0 is built specifically for Koshti to consume. It's designed around 4 main views. I'll kind of walk through them here in the app demo. So the dashboard is what shows like a list of projects. Pretty straightforward. A project is basically a GitHub repo. It's an endpoint that we can watch. So Brigade Core Brigade, Brigade Core Koshti, those are separate projects. And we have that GitHub endpoint that we're looking at. And anytime there's a new commit pushed, we see that as an event. And you'll see that surface to the dashboard. You'll see some metadata. There was a commit, an issue comment 3 hours ago that caused Brigade to run. And it came back with some errors. So the next view that you get into is when you actually select a project. And it looks something like this. You see the name, you see some metadata, what the GitHub URL is. You surface sometimes information about sidecars and images, namespaces. Those are specific terms to the Kubernetes world. Really what this view is about is showing recent events, recent activity. So this is, I think, like the most kind of interesting view in Koshti. The first view, the dashboard, is just like a stepping stone, because you don't care about everything. You're usually coming in here for a specific reason to explore a specific project for updates. And then the third view here is it's examining an event. It's what we used to call a build, and I know Kent has probably talked about this. We had more of an opinionated lean towards CIA type terminology in the first version of Brigade and the first version of Koshti. Really, a build is just an event, and we want to try and keep it as generic and open as we can, and use the word event instead of build where possible. So this view is a view of an event, and at the top you see some sort of like start and finish data, and this was intended to be like an actual physical timeline, to use a charting library and display the tasks that ran, kind of similar to how you would see like the timeline of the page render. The idea of it being this like waterfall set of processes at the top that are summarized from left to right. And then further down the page, you see the expanded tree of those tasks, those jobs, and what logs exist for them. And then the final view is a job view. It doesn't exist on this build because 0 jobs ran. All we see is the overview from the worker. I'm going to go back up a level and find one that has some child jobs. Okay, so I'm going to try this one here. That is also empty. This one is empty. Pull request synchronize. Okay, let's see. Try the red one. I should have saved one earlier to speed up this process. Okay, so this one, which is GitHub, GitHub initiated this event. It is a check suite that was re-requested. It started via build commit. So this is 12 jobs. So this is a whole bunch of stuff to look at. So here at the top, you can kind of see the timeline being represented, the series of things that ran. I believe it's shown in alphabetical order rather than chronological order. which is, again, something that's not ideal. We wanted this visualization to be more nuanced and to show more of the, to better reflect the overall build. So if I examine one of these, like this build API server, you'll get to the job page, and that really is just like a log, which is a pretty standard page. It's marked as successful, so you kind of have a green stripe effect. You have a little badge that says succeeded. The most important stuff is, started at, and then at the bottom, finished at, and then inside you can kind of see, some details on what happened. There was 16 steps. It did a cleanup, all kind of standard stuff from this this Docker build that took place. So those are like the 4 screens in Koshti. So it is a pretty small interface. We have the dashboard, we have the project view, we have an event view, and then we can drill down further into specific jobs within that event. And each time you click, you're getting a kind of a new hash here in the URL string. And that all kind of maps to the Brigade API. So here's where I'm going to kind of show, you should be able to see the endpoints that are being fetched. So for example, this job, which has a build ID, build-cli-1- and then like this string. If I copy that, you will see that when this page is being loaded, you should be able to see that request to the API. That's the CSS. Let's see, where's the build? Okay, so here it is down here. So the hash for the event is the same. That's what it hits in the API endpoint here. Let's make this really big for you guys for a sec. So api.brigade.sh v1 so job, and then the job ID. So that's what Koshti is pinging in the API and pulling in the metadata and the log. So it's a very quick run through of like how the screen flow is in Koshti. You'll notice, there's no login, there's no user interface, there's no actions you can perform. All you're doing is opening parts of the API and presenting the data. It is a one-way read-only interface. There's no actions. Okay, so from there, I'm going to just pop over to the first set of wireframes, which is kind of talking back to the atomic design kind of idea about modular elements. So here is kind of like the first master wireframe that I made for the project, as we tried to kind of figure out views and like what things would be interesting to get from Brigade events. This is kind of like the first process, which is like laying out lots of little cards to see, what things should be put with what other things, how do we represent pipelines and so forth. So the homepage really is very simple. It's a bunch of projects. Here I have them stacked like cards on top of each other. The only really interesting thing about a project at that level we thought was the state of it. Is it passing or failing? Potentially you could have a dashboard that is extracting way more interesting information from within a project, from within some of its builds. But ultimately we felt like that kind of information, that child level information belonged lower down in subsequent views rather than on the dashboard, because the dashboard should be pretty minimal and focused, and it's about finding the project you want to look at. And the more time we spent extracting data, we felt would be wasted. But that might be something you feel differently about. This is the project view then, which we had looked at a minute ago. It's the project or the repo of the code base that you're running Brigade on. So you want some high-level summary of what that project is, which should map to your GitHub repo, the GitHub URL, exposing some of the info from the Brigade project, which is, got like things like Docker images and so forth. The project then has the chronological list of tasks, which we see down here, which that's really where state is calculated, like the most recent event in your list of tasks under that project should then tell you overall, is the project healthy or not? So when we talk about project health, I think that was really just mapped to most recent event health. And that's a UX decision. You know, you could potentially think about averaging it. You could think about representing more than one particular event. But for simplicity, really, I think we felt that that gets messy, and often it really is just, you know, did the thing that most recently ran succeed or not is the simplest way for Kashti to view things. So yeah, I have sticky notes kind of put on these wireframes, you know, project views, looking at the status of the project. You know, would we want to introduce performance? Is the speed of Brigade an interesting piece of data that we might want to reveal? For us internally on the team, we've always kind of been proud of how quick Brigade runs. You know, when you look at other build tools, Brigade is pretty, it's pretty quick. It's pretty, I think it's one of the core strengths of the project, and we don't really talk about it a lot. But performance, you know, this thing ran in 2 seconds and we have results. It can really shine compared to some of the more common tooling that our industry likes to use. The pipeline. So this is kind of like, when you look at a project, do you want to see all the things that are connected? Like, what is Brigade looking for? You know, GitHub activity is one. You know, maybe there's a particular type of, maybe there's a particular endpoint that is being looked for. Is it connected to, you know, is there a new Slack message? Is there, you know, did someone log in, log out? You know, like, to think about things that you might be interested in seeing. I guess a way I like to think of this is like, what is Brigade's like scanning? What is it looking for? So, you know, has there been a new Docker image pushed? Do we care about that? Do we only care about pull requests and commits? This really maps back to what you configure Brigade to do for your team. And, you know, I think we'll talk about this a bit more in a minute, but like the configuration of Brigade, you configure specific things for it to look for that you will consider how you define the events for that project. And one of our UX ideas was, well, should that be part of the overview? You know, this is specifically what this project is monitoring. So if you could update the configuration of your project to have a new author, a new trigger for events, then, you know, is it interesting to summarize that on the project, on the UI? This ties into one of the ideas we had with Kashti. You know, switching between your code editor and the UI, do we want to try and bridge those gaps? Often the config is written in YAML, and you have a lot of stuff in there. I'm sorry, not YAML. Brigade is using JavaScript for configuration. A lot of projects we use are YAML based. That is not the case here. But if you go in your editor and you update your Brigade project configuration to have a new type of event classification, and then you come back to the Kashti interface, I thought it'd be cool to represent those changes and to basically summarize that configuration for you. So you're not just seeing the output, but you're also seeing what's informing the input for that particular project. So then you kind of have the chronological list of things that the project is displaying, the results. This is, you know, basically this view of things. So you want it to be sorted in a pretty simple manner, you know, the things that most recently ran. Here you'll notice we have an extra column for how long it actually took to run. Did it take a few seconds or a couple of minutes? You know, things like that. Again, that's kind of like, those are design decisions. What is useful to bubble up? What is most useful to show? So, you know, there's notes in the wireframe. Are we more interested in focusing on builds or a task flow like Concourse? So those are some of the rival CI/CD tools and interfaces that we looked at when we were researching this project. You know, do we want our chronological display of events to look like the stuff that's on the left, which is a list, or like a map or chart, like what's on the right, which is what Concourse did? Ultimately, we kind of lean more towards the left-hand format. And then the configuration. So I was just talking about this a little bit. you'll see a lot of this stuff in the Brigade documentation. This is how Brigade runs. When you're using Brigade, you're writing configuration that looks something like this. And you commit this file to your GitHub repo as part of your project. And then what Koshti is doing when it looks at a project, it's getting the API returning, events and results. But we also have access to the config in Koshti. I believe, I think we had an endpoint for that in the API. I should check. But one of the things we wondered, which could be an interesting differentiator for Koshti, is to display the configuration that you wrote and you put it in your project here in the UI, so that you're trying to figure out, well, why is this build failing? To look at an example of one of these red ones. You have an issue where something is not working the way it was conceived, and maybe something timed out, maybe a container or something it was trying to ping doesn't exist anymore. But often it's because you wrote a configuration that has something problematic in it. So often when you're in the developer workflow and you're making changes, you're pushing them up, you're rerunning the Brigade process to see, okay, does this resolve the issue, turn it from red to green? I think there's a gap between the editing, the writing, the pushing, and to seeing the results. And we thought it'd be interesting to be able to access the config in the UI alongside the results, so you could see why things ran the way they did, and potentially, could you actually edit them in the UI? GitHub, has kind of done this for a few years, where you can look at a file and say, oh, this is wrong, this is a typo. And you can actually use the browser to edit a file directly and commit it to your project. And we, kind of fantasized about having a similar process here for Koshti, that you see that a job ran and failed for some reason. Maybe you had a typo and you just want to fix it. How cool would it be if you could just access the config as part of your project overview, and you edit it, pop out a little window, correct the code, push it, save it, and have the Koshti UI sort of like instigate that as a commit back to the original Brigade.js configuration. So you don't have to go through separate tools and so forth. And this did not happen, obviously, in Koshti 1.0. Koshti 1 is read-only. It extracts data. It does not write anywhere. It doesn't allow you to interact with Brigade. It's just consuming. But I'll come back to this. This was like kind of a what-if scenario that we thought was interesting. Okay, and then to kind of like look more specifically at the pipeline, which is what is at the core of Brigade. Here in the kind of like the atomic design way of thinking about the interface, I'm thinking about the timeline of an event. I have a card at the top that's the author, then the actual event itself, which was instigated by the author, then the task, which is basically like the action, which can contain logs. And then further down, we have child jobs. So a build happens. So for example, there was a GitHub push that this was the event. So we pushed this particular commit to our master branch. Then Brigade detected that push and said, okay, I've noticed there's a new commit. This is according to my configuration over here. When I notice a push, I'm going to run these tasks. So build 121 is initiated. We have some basic metadata at the time it started at, the info that triggered it, which ties back up to the parent event. And then there's basically the process that runs, which may have a log, and sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. You might have got a sense of that from looking at the Koshti demo we have, where some events, we say there's 0 jobs ran, it started and ended, but it didn't spawn any additional processes. There can be a situation where there are child jobs that run. And what we want Koshti to do is to be able to handle both of those situations pretty cleanly. If there are child jobs, you should be able to look at each one of them and explore logs if they are there. And you should be able, and they should be reflected in a chronological way, so that you have, the first thing that ran, then when that completed, this one ran, or are they running in parallel? How does the UI represent that? So these wireframes are really just trying to lay out different scenarios. What if it was like this? What if it was like that? And then this final kind of panel here is just like looking at all of these together. if we think about the UI and the overall experience we want someone to have, how do we arrange those different kind of like atomic parts of the UI in a way that tells the story? So we're looking at the pipeline and we want the overall context of what has happened. So this person, the author, did this, which caused this to happen. And that's really the kind of core of what Koshti is trying to do. Much like the if this then do that application model, we want it to be very simple, like cause and effect. Here's the results. And you should just see a summary of whether it worked or didn't work. You'll notice here in our original wireframes, we thought about showing the configuration that was used by Brigade in determining this particular task, and to actually display that alongside the results. So, that was kind of one of our early UX goals. It didn't continue just because of the nature of it involving more, it just never happened. It would have been a cool thing to do. Okay, so just to kind of take a step back up, that's like a run through of how the key 4 views in Koshti are formulated. On the left, we have the dashboard. On the next item column over is the project view, which is kind of like high level. And then we get down into the nitty gritty of how builds run, what happens, And one of the things that we really wanted to do in the UX of this project was to kind of find ways to make it easier, save our users some steps. You get results and it says this succeeded, and you get a log. We kind of wondered, how can we make that more interesting? What kind of things can we do to make it more, more helpful? So how about, if we know people are running specific types of events, is there ways we can notice patterns and incorporate those into the interface so that we're kind of presenting highlights and little snippets of observations back to the user? So for example, instead of just saying, job succeeded after this much time, did this seem like was there an image pushed? Was there a commit? Was there a deploy? Did this, succeed? Was there like a URL returned? Was there was something pushed to a particular place? Was it a repository, a container registry? To try and like parse the logs that we got back and say, okay, here's like an IP address that came back in somewhere in the log. We said, okay, this has been pushed to here. This might be a web address that the user cares about. Or we see there's an SSH path or something, that to offer people shortcuts, external links, basically scraping the logs for particular patterns that seem like human behavior and rendering them as buttons, rendering them as labels, so that the user has like a kind of a highlight. An example of this I see often in my daily work is the Netlify UI, which I talked about earlier. Netlify builds websites out of commits. So I'll show you an example. This is the Helm project that I work on. We run it on Netlify, and every time the site is deployed, an event happens. There's a deploy to the site, and you get a job that looks kind of like this. You see that it's published. So if I click into this, we know that like there's a log, stuff happens, and at the end it says site is live. But Netlify is able to kind of examine all that information and say, okay, this succeeded. It gives you a summary. 3 files were uploaded, 5 redirect rules were processed. Contents are secure. We didn't notice any mixed content in your files. The build time was pretty quick, and then it ultimately gives you a preview deploy link at the top, because it knows that there's going to be a URL at the end from what was built, and it just like puts that at the top of the interface. So you see this worked, and here's where you go to access, the preview for what you just did. And because we think about Brigade and Koshti as representing open-ended events, that could be anything. It could be a deployment. It could be like a cron job kind of thing. I think there's lots of fun stuff you could do to scrape some of the logs and some of the output feedback from a Brigade event and render shortcuts for the user. I think that would be a really nice UX thing to have, and it's something we wanted to explore. We didn't really though. I mean, ultimately we just had pass, fail, the time a particular process took to run, and similar metadata. I think this is kind of like an untapped area. Okay, so I'm going to switch on now to the next wireframe. I'm going to stop the screen share for a sec. So hopefully you're all still bearing with me. I can talk kind of quick about some of the stuff, and I have an Irish accent, which can also make things confusing. So, you know, sorry about that. Please, you know, feel free to ping me directly if there's a part of this you would like to see me explore more. I'm going to move on to the next set of wireframes, which is a little less deconstructed and a little bit more like an interface. Okay, so it looks kind of like this. I've laid out a whole bunch of screens in a similar kind of flow manner to the last file, but this looks a little bit more like interfaces. And I think I've made this a bit more presentable, you know, with notes and so forth than the previous one, but I wanted you to understand the design thinking that got to this point. So this is pretty standard UI. You have a main top nav, which is where you are in Koshti. You have a left-hand side nav, which is aspects of your view that you're looking at. And then the main part of the window is displaying, you know, the logs and info. And the top right-hand corner would have been the place to put like user information, logging in, logging out. That is something that we did not build. And that's what the yellow sticky notes here really kind of display. So design principles, try to show as few things as are really necessary, especially on high-level screens. Some of the interfaces that I looked at, like Circle CI, like there's just stuff everywhere, and it's hard to tell which direction you're kind of flowing in. I like the idea of an app that has movement from left to right. So when you click into something, you know, kind of like moves back to being like the parent object, and the stuff that you've opened should kind of be coming in from the right-hand side. You can think about that in an abstract way, or you can actually like animate that with a lot of, you know, tools. Angular has a nice animation library. So here the left-hand side is like, when we look at a project, it's displaying all the aspects of that project, you know. What is the configuration? And is there secrets configured for that project? Have you got different project level things that you have created? Maybe there's user management. Maybe there are pipelines that you can view or oversee from this level in the app. And then the actual like results of Brigade events. You know, do you want to view bills? Do you want to view logs? You know, all that stuff should be pretty straightforward. Moving over. Oh, sorry, actually, this is the dashboard. So this is actually technically a level up. So this is the first screen, which shows you the projects that exist, should show you the state of those things. So for example, in this scenario, Helm is processing, draft has succeeded. And usually it's you don't have too many nuanced states because it gets confusing. You want a success state, a fail state, and maybe a currently processing state. You know, you could build extra complexity into that. You know, maybe something is waiting, maybe something is queued, but that is a lot more work. So I would try and keep that sort of stuff as simple as you can. And the yellow sticky note, just kind of from the user point of view, what is the state of my projects is kind of the main concern of the dashboard. Add a new project if I need to. That is something that we never did. You cannot add a project through the interface. Adding a project means you create an entire new Brigade configuration file, which is this JavaScript file defining the types of events that Brigade is looking for. In theory, you could, you know, have a way of creating that through the interface. It would be very fun, but it would be very complicated. You know, that might be something you want to explore. And then again, this is the project view. So like we've seen in the Koshti demo, like I had kind of deconstructed in the previous wireframe, this is showing you high-level metadata about the project. You know, this is draft. It's one of our early Deis Labs projects at Azure. It was a Kubernetes deployment tool. And here you can kind of see very quickly that this has state. That's the thing we're highlighting. And all this state badge is doing is bubbling up the status from the last event. So there's examples over here on the right. You know, is this currently building? It's in progress, in process. This has failed. There are some differences here. So This version of the wireframes has some of those extra UX ideas we talked about that did not kind of make it into the built version of Koshti due to time constraints, resource constraints. Sometimes it was API constraints or the fact that we didn't necessarily know how to do a certain thing without kind of really putting in more work than we could. So one of them here is the pipeline idea. The last wireframe had the idea of representing pipelines on this view. So that's like, what is this project watching for? What is configured in the project JavaScript file? So for example, here, when one is underway, we have detected an event. That event has 4 tasks that are going to run, and we can tell you that that is currently processing. And even here that it's queued. That would be really cool. That might be beyond the initial capabilities of this project. But I like the idea of kind of making the data seem like it's alive. Like when you look at a project, is it actually doing anything? Is this dormant? Is this a dead project? Or is it actively watching? It's actively looking at certain endpoints. What are those endpoints? And then on the right-hand side, I have the project configuration button, the idea being that would open the JavaScript file that your project is using. So that would tell you what pipelines are configured, what is being looked for, what are the triggers that are going to run. And then the rest of the screen is pretty straightforward. You see the list of events. This particular wireframe had some filters. So it had the ability to maybe sort events by certain types. That could be based on some rules around the author of the event. So for example, if something is initiated by a GitHub bot, we know that's probably tied to commits. If we see container image, pushes or pulls, that might be something we want to isolate. Those again are kind of more like lower level implementation details. Do you want all the data to be tabular and presented equally? Do you want ways to be able to filter it and look for specific things? And it really depends on whether or not you want to kind of tailor Koshti to a specific use case. Here is an alternate UI I had presented for whether we wanted the project state to reflect more of an average of recent builds or the most recent builds, which is what we ended up doing. How would you potentially show health across 9, 10 events, maybe a day? How do you do that? So I think that kind of gets confusing, but it might be interesting to you guys. And then this is the screen for clicking into a particular event and seeing what happened. So here's a kind of a better way of showing the task kind of timeline, the chronological waterfall graph that we failed to implement it properly. The current Koshti UI just shows like a bunch of divs in a row for representing each one of the tasks that took place, but they're not, they don't really reflect, the proper sequence. They don't reflect, the actual like length of those events. So the idea was to use like a charting library that would better do that for us, but it just required a lot of custom JavaScript stuff that we didn't really have the time to do. But it would be really cool. And the idea was, that this at the top of the screen would serve as a map for a really complicated event. If you had an event that ran, perhaps like the example I showed you earlier in the Koshti demo that had 12 child jobs, that's a big page, that's a lot of scrolling. So this summary at the top, you could click those and have them be anchor shortcuts down to the specific tasks. So you could get quickly down to the one that had an issue or the one that you wanted to examine instead of having a big long scroll. And that part is easy enough to do, is more so the proportion and the sorting order of the graph events that we struggled with. And to talk a little bit about the design of the events themselves here, we're trying to reflect the tree of the hierarchy. Every event has a start and an end, and the in-between can really vary a lot depending on the configuration and what happened. So the start, we decided like to try and think about it like cards. The author card, this person, whether it's a bot or a user for a particular platform or so forth, did a thing. What is that thing? Can we extract specific values like commits or timestamps and display them to kind of tell the story of what that is that happened. And then we have the tasks that happened underneath it. And we really wanted to nest everything in a way that mapped back to the config, so that architecturally it made sense that whatever way you composed your configuration, we wanted the output in Koshti to reflect that. So the rather than displaying everything as an equal citizen, we wanted to sort of nest children under parents and so forth. It does get very messy when you have a lot of jobs and then also a lot of logs, because the logs could be, insanely long. So we had some different ideas about that, and I have kind of an alternate UI that I'll come back to near the end of this to kind of walk you through. And then ultimately, what happened? Did things succeed? If they did succeed, could we extract, some of the highlights from that? And then the last div is the kind of like the finale of the event. So it's indented, it's an equal item to the parent. Everything in between is considered kind of like a bullet list to be indented a little bit because it's a child of that. But then this comes out to close it. In terms of spacing, it's just directly aligned. Status is updated, timestamps. And for timestamps, you could look at things like Moment.js and some of the newer libraries that render dates to be, more like in human words, or you could do the intense, like more the non-formatted long forms timestamp with time zones and so forth. Really, there's different ways to think about how long ago something happened, how long it took to run. Whether or not you want to simplify that stuff is up to you. So here's an example where one of the UX goals for the project, when we talked about having Koshti be interactive and actually able to tweak your configuration, to be able to shrink the gap between the editing experience and the result evaluating experience, was the idea of having the config for your project to be editable in the UI. So we talked a bit about the pipelines and being able to view the pipeline config in the UI. And if something failed, Brigade allows you to rerun things in a modular level. So you can isolate a particular task in your chain, in your configuration, and initiate a restart of that without having to run the whole thing, which is one of the UX goals we had. We didn't want this to be like other tools we'd use, that something takes 10 minutes to run and it fails, and then you have to start it again, and there's queuing and waiting, and it's just really slow. We wanted Brigade to be able to isolate specific parts and interact with those elements without having to run the whole thing. So here is an install process that failed. Go path is not set, which is something I've seen, and that you could potentially pull out that task, see the config that controlled it, edit the config, and rerun it all through Koshti without having to go into your code editor, pull up your configuration file, find the task you were just looking at that failed, figure out why it failed, modify it, commit it, push it up to GitHub, then wait for Brigade to do its thing, then come back to Koshti and see, okay, how did that go, and find the log and look at it. We're trying to basically go, how much can we condense that developer process and do it from here? Because that seemed really, really cool to us. That it just required a lot more work than we could accomplish in the first version. But the UX for that is here. So, you'll see some of those little things, the UX nice to haves. Here's another look at the config. Where when you open your configuration for the project, that it's like an overlay text window. Maybe it's highlighting a specific pipeline that you had been looking at in Koshti. And, we had different ideas for accessing the file directly, showing, this is interesting, yeah. So here, about 2/3 of the way down, you see Docker user, Docker email. The idea being that you could have secrets in your configuration that the UI does not let you see. They're hidden, and they're managed through a kind of like administration panel in your project configuration. You might want that to be limited to particular types of users, But from a security point of view, Secrets are obviously complicated. You know, if you want to put those things in your configuration and then have that in your committed into your repository, that's a very dangerous practice. So is there a way that we could put things in, have them encrypted, have them be at like a high level where they're controlled and organized, and then referenced where needed? You know, there's some UX ideas around that here. You guys, I think, are going to be investing a bit more work in the authentication and security of the interface. So maybe this is something that is of interest to you. But again, these are kind of like UX ideas that we thought could be interesting to help you evaluate like the events that ran, pull out some valuable highlights, allow you to simplify the process of editing, rerunning, and sort of like perfecting your events and your configuration, and trying to figure out how to just like make for an interesting, intuitive interface that does some things that we would like to have seen in some of the other tools that we were using. So things like configuration editing, kind of contextual, where's my contextual like highlights from jobs, you know, filtering, like recognizing patterns in the types of events and data that are being rendered and like categorizing them in a way that feels familiar to the developer. So some of that is very opinionated for us. You know, we're looking at a lot of Docker-based pushes and pulls, GitHub pulls, you know, and this was kind of like a source of complexity for us on the team, because we wanted Brigade to be an open-ended tool. We wanted Koshti to be an open-ended tool. But then when people start using it, we frequently find ourselves having to use examples and show them kind of configurations and workflows that are reflecting their own life. You know, so we very quickly always end up talking about CI/CD, talking about container registries, tooling that we use a lot in our team. And we end up shaping a lot of the conversation around Brigade and Koshti to use those familiar elements to the people we're talking to. And that is kind of like slightly in conflict to the ethos of Brigade, that we think about all events and they could be anything, and we want to stay abstract so that people don't get sandboxed into thinking like us, that really they should be able to use this for anything. But then also we need tangible examples that people can understand so they can appreciate the value of Brigade. And that's kind of just part of the duality of this project. How much you guys want to keep really like abstract terminology like in the interface versus how much you want to try and tailor it to particular problem sets, particular kind of workflows. You know, that's totally up to you guys, but this is something that we run into a lot in the interface, is the idea of how to keep it seem flexible, but still being opinionated in how we should share the value of the project. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to go back to my notes here a sec. And that was a long time. Hopefully you're all still with me here, but so that's kind of like a run through the wireframes. Let me talk real quick about the UI design. This will probably take about 5 minutes, and then I think I can wrap up. Okay, so screen sharing again. Okay, so back here looking at my notes. Okay, so UI front-end elements. So Koshti is built out of like an Angular starter app that was created by a company called Zurb. They had a framework called Foundation. They still have it, but used a specific version from probably around 2015 or 2017 maybe, Foundation 6. So the front end is using this particular framework. Like any framework, it's CSS and some very minimal JavaScript elements, which I don't think Koshti really uses any of. So it's using a Flexbox-based CSS grid. It's all written through Sass. I do a lot of front-end styling with CSS and Sass, so I've customized that quite a lot. And you can grab that and reuse that as you see fit. So if you're trying to look at the Koshti 1.0, this is what it's built on top of. You know, don't use this or don't use this. It's totally up to you guys. But that's what's in the first version. Typography, all that stuff. So the third kind of wireframe I have here is really not a wireframe. It's just like a mock-up of the theme. So this was based off of the Brigade colors, the branding, which is kind of using a Kubernetes blue, a Microsoft Azure blue, and then complementary tones that can easily be combined for making, very, very light backgrounds, dark text. The idea is to be as legible and accessible as possible. So these colors are all sort of like sent as variables in the front-end Sass files. And then anytime in the UI you're doing something, you can say, okay, I want to use brand 1 for this, like 4 for this, and so forth. So this color scheme is, I think, a pretty simple one. And the idea is it feels just like a clean, modern app. That's what's in the current Koshti. And it also includes the typeface, which I believe is called Nonito. Oh, sorry, this is Europa. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, this is the font I use, Nonito Sans. So it's an open source font. Where possible, we try and keep everything open source on a project like this. This font has a little bit of rounding in it, which kind of is meant to be, Koshti is meant to be pretty light and friendly. So it's a simple sans serif font. We used a library called Ion Icons for the actual UI iconography. These are all very standard, right? Like, ticks and X's for success or fail, arrows, for drop-down menus and so forth. There's a whole bunch of competing libraries. Use whatever feels right to you. This is the one that's used in V1. Okay, so that's kind of like a summary of the first version of Koshti. I have another file I want to show you guys real quick. This was like a UX enhancement that we wanted to do. It did not get finished, partially my fault because of busyness with other projects. But the project view that I was walking through earlier, we talk about, sorry, not the project view, the event view. When an event takes place and you look at the event, you see the author, you see the configuration that triggered the event, and then you see the sort of like the tree of child tasks and jobs and logs within those. And it starts to get like really long and messy on a really big event. And as we started to dog food Koshti and use it ourselves, we noticed that pages were really, really long and it gets complicated. So I'm going to go back to the example of that I had that had 12 jobs in it. I think it was this one. Yeah. So you see there's all these different jobs, right? And you also then have this huge kind of like this bunch of logs that are not attached to one of the 12 jobs. This is the actual worker that ran. This is like the parent log. So basically that log is for the event itself. So that's kind of like happening at the parent level, and all of the 12 jobs are spun off underneath that. But we found the UI to be really annoying. We would come in and look at, we wanted to see what was going on with the build CLI. Because we had a log at the top here in the first panel, that log could often be super long. It could be super short. It was a random, unknown variable. So the UI for the jobs could often be, a 20-second scroll down the page. And it didn't work because this page is supposed to give you a high-level overview of everything that happened. And then you can quickly find the thing you care about and navigate into that and isolate it and have a URL that you could share with your colleagues or so forth to quickly get to that piece of data. So the quick workaround was to take the worker log, the parent of what's happening, and basically put it all the way down the bottom so that you could surface the jobs quicker. But in terms of the architecture of what Brigade is doing, what the actual flow of events is, it's not honest. And we didn't quite know how to handle that. So I ultimately felt like the design we had for this page is just not working. It's really wide, it's really long. There's a lot of wasted space. So this is a mock-up for an alternate approach. The idea being to kind of use tabs. And I think I've sent this file to you guys along with the other Koshti wireframes. So on the left-hand side, you get the elements that are in the current view. The tree, you get the name, the timestamps, and then the kind of indentation of children. But then you also have a second pane, which is this black window with the logs in it. And by default, when you open your event, you're seeing the logs for the worker, for the parent. But you should be able to see the jobs on the left-hand side pretty quickly. And then basically the left-hand side tabs are a menu. You can click on job info, and this reloads the window here to display that jobs log. So the idea is to take the logs out of the long list of stuff, move them to the side, and allow you to see an overview and navigate in one column and to see the lower level info on the other column. I hope that makes sense, but the idea is it's the same elements, it's just reorganizing the page to try and allow you a clearer overview of things. Okay, so I'm at about an hour now. It's taken a long time. Thank you for your patience thus far. But this is just hopefully an interesting run through what's there. You know, keep what aspects you feel are useful. Throw away anything that seems, you know, like too much. I guess I just wanted to leave you with some summary thoughts, you know. The wireframes, I think, show a lot of ideas in the stickies and some of the principles we talked about, where we were trying to figure out from a user point of view, how can we delight the user? What things can we do that they don't see in some of the existing logging and kind of like pipeline orientated tools? And to summarize, we thought the pipeline that is configured for the project, it's looking for certain things, it's active. It's not like this arbitrary piece of configuration that should only live in your editor. We wanted to bring it out into the interface so that when something happens, we could have the context for what initiated that build to be available to you as a user. So you could pull it up and compare the result with the initial trigger. And even better, if we could make that editable, if we could bridge the gap between the input and the output, we felt like that would be very interesting for dynamic container-based scripting. And I think there's like a lot of interesting opportunity there that hasn't been kind of like investigated. And look at things like Azure pipelines, look at some of the new developer tools that do this stuff, that think about jobs, that kind of like take a configuration and run a bunch of stuff in your project. It's an interesting space, and perhaps Koshti can do some stuff like that. It may be out of scope, but I think it's interesting. And then some of the other UX stuff we talked about that doesn't exist in the read-only Koshti, the idea of surfacing actions from the results of an event, you know, open a URL, visit a container registry, preview the deploy that you built, you know, stuff like that. Think about how Koshti and Brigade could be useful in different scenarios, and like what types of information would you want to see highlighted. Think about your own life, your own tooling, your own processes as you start playing around with these tools. What things do you think make sense? What stuff is arbitrary? Like we didn't want Brigade to require a lot of Kubernetes-centric knowledge. You write your config in JavaScript so that it should be accessible to as many developers as possible. So we wanted the terminology and the way of thinking about events to be approachable. And we wanted Koshti to reflect and highlight that as much as possible and not get bogged down in talking about Kubernetes pods or, like specific tooling that's under the hood. You should be able to kind of like adjust that to suit your own workflow. And actually one of the ideas that tied into that a little bit, to pull up this, where we talk about filtering and categorizing events in different ways, there's opinionated takes on it where you say, okay, I have deploys and pushes and releases. What if potentially you were able to create your own labels in your configuration for what events are and what they mean to you and your team, and have Koshti reflect that. It's really open-ended. So that's something you guys might want to think about. We want to think about builds in the new version to be pretty open-ended, and we don't want to just be like a CI/CD methodology. Okay, so yeah, it's kind of over to you guys. Bring your vision to this. Design-wise, starting out, you figure out your constraints and your goals. What things should Koshti do or not do? Do you want to rebuild this from the ground up? Do you want to take the Angular app that's there, the CSS theme, the initial API structure, and build off of that? adapt it to the new API for Brigade 2.0. And that's really kind of like a bunch of important decisions for you and your team. It's tricky, but I think you guys can save yourselves a ton of work if you use some of the stuff that's already there. You could just take like the CSS and the front end style and drop it into a different set of tools that you want to use. You could fork the project as it is and just adapt the API structure to the new model, and then you have a working app really quickly. Building it from the ground up is going to be a lot more work, but also maybe that's something you want to do, that you really want to get that experience. It's up to you guys. You know, I always like the idea of using what's available and not reinventing the wheel, but yeah, it's the decision is yours. It's going to be an interesting road for you guys, and hopefully your sponsors can be helpful along the way. So I'll close up my stuff here. Let me see. I think that was kind of it. Yeah. I'll make these notes all available, and thank you for your patience. You know, we're really interested to see what you come up with for this project. We can guide you as best as we can. I guess like the more existing elements you decide to keep or adapt, the more helpful we can be. If you're going to build something new and exciting, then we'll be kind of coming along for the ride with you guys to learn what that is too, because you know, we're not a front end team, but we have some rough skills ourselves. So hopefully we can figure out how best to be useful to you. Okay, thanks.